The Byzantine theology. The first thing I think we need to get clear about this term is that it's not a term anybody in the period would have used. It's a modern way of referring to the later Christian stage of the Roman Empire, which became more and more a Greek empire, ruled from Constantinople, which was founded by Constantine as his city in 330, and was actually known as New Rome. And from that time onwards, 330, one can, I suppose, think in terms of what modern scholars call the Byzantine Empire. Byzantinos theologos, Byzantine theologian, if it had been used at all in the early Christian world, would have meant a theologian from Constantinople. It's theology that was written almost entirely in Greek, though its resources go wider than that. Much of the Byzantine Empire, certainly in its early period, was not a monolingual empire. Greek was the common language of trade, the common language of communication, but in the western part of the empire, Latin was important. In the eastern part of the empire, there were areas where people spoke Syriac, or in the southeast spoke Coptic, a version of it, which is what the Arabs called Egyptian, and the term still survives. And Byzantine theology owes a great deal to all of these different linguistic expressions of Christianity, particularly perhaps Syriac. So the period we're looking at is from about 330 until, well, the fall of Constantinople in 1453 to the Ottoman Turks. Most people thinking about Byzantine theology, or who know anything about it, will probably think of Byzantine theology as being very much in the earlier part of that period. And there's a reason for this, and I'll come to that in a moment. But Byzantine theology continued right through until the fall of Constantinople in 1453, and indeed the last century or so was a period of intense theological activity. It's a great mistake to think of Byzantine theology as just simply something that simply belongs to the very early centuries of the Christian Church. Another way of recharacterizing it, and which also makes the link with modern Orthodox theology, which is deeply indebted to Byzantine theology, is to think of the authority of theology in this period as deriving from the ecumenical councils, when the Church gathered together to solve the theological issues of the day. And there are 7 ecumenical councils that are accepted both by the Roman Catholic Church and by the Orthodox Church. 7 councils, the first in the 4th century, the Council of Nicaea in 325, and the last in the 8th century, 787, also held in Nicaea. And that last council was a council, the council that defended and legitimated the veneration and making of icons. And this period, from the 4th to the 8th century, is certainly a core period for Byzantine theology. So, who is it? Who are these Byzantine theologians? Who are the people we're talking about? Well, to start off with, I think the most important people are people like Athanasius and Cyril, who were patriarchs or popes of Alexandria in the 4th and in the 5th century. And then also in the same sort of period, right in the middle of that period, the 3 theologians that are generally referred to as the Cappadocian Fathers: Basil the Great, Gregory of Nazianzus, or Gregory the Theologian, as is more commonly called in the Orthodox world, and Gregory of Nyssa. Also a contemporary of theirs, slightly younger contemporary of theirs, John Chrysostom. But before we move forward, I think we ought to move back slightly, because all of these theologians were profoundly influenced by probably the greatest theologian who ever wrote in Greek, Origen, who belongs to the 3rd century and who died as a result of the tortures that he received in the Decian persecution in the middle of the 3rd century. Origen is is a towering figure, and so towering that it's actually quite difficult, I think, for us to get a grasp of this. So many of his works failed to survive, partly because there were so many, and partly because his reputation became questionable. But he was the greatest commentator on Scripture, and anybody in the 4th century wanting to know anything about Scripture would have to have recourse to Origen. He wrote commentaries on virtually all the books of the Bible, both Old and New Testament. He also wrote introductory works to theology. He wrote works of apologetics defending Christianity against classical opposition to it. The writers of the 4th century are all in one way or another indebted to Origen and could not but be. And so we must sort of bear in mind Origen lies behind this, though he's, if you like, a pre-Byzantine theologian. After the 5 theologians I've mentioned, 6 theologians I've mentioned, important figures are, first of all, the writer who wrote under the title of Dionysius the Areopagite, Paul's convert, after his speech on the Areopagus in Rome, which is recorded in Acts 17. At the end of that chapter, we're told that Dionysius and Damaris were converted to Christianity. And there's a body of works that emerges in the beginning of the 6th century that are ascribed to Dionysius. They're certainly not 1st century writings, they're almost certainly 6th century writings, written shortly before they were discovered. But their authenticity was accepted for a millennium or more, and their influence is enormous, both in Eastern and in Western Christianity, though the influence is rather different. And I'll come to some of this later on. Other great early figures are Maximus, the Confessor, who was born in 580 and died in 662, an exile, mutilated, banned from the empire in an area now in modern Georgia called Lazica. And also John of Damascus, who possibly we could say shouldn't be included in this group because John of Damascus never ever lived in the Byzantine Empire. He lived in Palestine, and born in Syria in Damascus, and lived most of his life, I think, in Jerusalem. But he lived in this part of the world after the Arab conquest, and he wrote his theology, if you like, in the shadow of the domes of the Muslim mosques on the Dome of the Rock. But he would have thought of himself as a citizen of the Roman Empire and would have thought of the Islamic occupation, as I think he would have thought of it, as Palestine, as a passing event. But it still hasn't passed. After that, there are actually a lot of theologians, very, very little known in the West. An example, for instance, would be Photius, the great patriarch of Alexandria, of Constantinople, in the 8th century, 9th century. At the turn of the millennium, there is a great monastic figure called Simeon the New Theologian, and the person who wrote his life and edited his works, Nikitas Stithatos, is another important Byzantine figure. Another figure, in some ways rather different, is Michael Psellos, who was enormously learned, very much if you like, in the tradition of Photius, the patriarch. Enormously learned, and particularly learned in pagan philosophy. The fact actually that we know anything about late Neoplatonism is probably due to the fact that Psellos had many of these works copied and preserved. After that, there really are theologians of every century, right up to the last century of the Byzantine Empire, which was much preoccupied by a controversy about the monks on Mount Athos, some of whom claimed that in their prayer they could behold the uncreated light of the Godhead. And they were defended by St. Gregory of Palamas, who has become a very important figure in modern Orthodox theology.